Hello, I'm R.A. Spratt. I write and perform this podcast. If you'd like to support the show, I'm a children's author, so you can buy a book by me, or you can buy me a coffee by going to buymeacoffee.com/storiesRASpratt. It's an easy way to make a small thank you gift to the show so I can keep kicking this can down the road. The podcast directory you're using right now should have a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page in the show notes, or you can type it into your browser. That's buymeacoffee.com/storiesRASpratt. All contributions are gratefully appreciated. Hello and welcome to Bedtime Stories with me, R.A. Spratt. All right, well, it's not long now until my next book comes out, which is The Epically Awesome Odyssey as Told by Nanny Piggins, which of course features stories I've already told on this podcast. So my publisher is getting me all geared up for that and doing publicity. I've got an event this Friday at the State Library. And so I've been doing some Greek myths for this podcast. I thought, well, the next book I write should be about the Iliad, the actual war of Troy itself. So I thought if I'm going to tell the story of the Trojan War, then I need to go right back to the beginning and start with the cause of the Trojan War, which was, of course, Helen of Troy. So that is the story I'm going to do for you today, the story of Helen of Troy. Here we go. Helen of Troy, as told by Nanny Piggins. "No, I said no, and I meant no," said Nanny Piggins firmly. Derek, Samantha and Michael had just returned home from school, but when they stepped into the house, Nanny Piggins wasn't able to give them her full attention straight away because she was on the telephone. She mouthed the word sorry and indicated by rolling her eyes that she thought the person on the other end of the phone was a nincompoop, then pointed to the big stack of Anzac biscuits on the kitchen table and motioned for the children to start eating. Nanny Piggins had very expressive eyebrows, especially when it came to conveying food-related messages. "I understand that you're in a terrible dilemma," continued Nanny Piggins, "but I don't have time to fly to Paris right now. Now come along, stop crying." "Who's she talking to?" Michael asked Boris. "Oh, Vogue magazine," said Boris. "You do realise that I'm one of identical 14 uplets, don't you?" continued Nanny Piggins. "Have you tried contacting one of my sisters? They all said no. What, even Wendy? She couldn't because she's in a maximum security prison. Well, actually, that sounds about right. Look, I'll tell you what. I'll bake a circular saw into a chocolate cake and post it to her in prison. Make sure you're waiting outside the front gate with a large sack when she escapes. Then you can kidnap her and make her do it." "No, that's all right. My pleasure." "No, you cannot give my love to Anna Wintour. I haven't forgiven her yet." "All right, goodbye." Nanny Piggins hung up. "Sorry about that," said Nanny Piggins. "They were begging me to be on the cover of their magazine for Fashion Week." "Don't they have supermodels who can do that?" asked Samantha. "Well, apparently there's been a big scandal," said Nanny Piggins. "It turns out that none of the supermodels actually have superpowers. They can't fly, they don't have super strength, they can't even leap tall buildings in a single bound. They've all gone into hiding because of the shame." Boris wept. "Those poor women. It would be so hard to hide when you're so tall and willowy. I know from experience, if you're over 6 feet tall and you hide in a crate, after 8 or 9 hours, you get a horrible crick in your neck." "Yes, well, I've spent all day on the phone being badgered by every fashion magazine in the world," said Nanny Piggins. "At least Marie Claire magazine had the imagination to send me a begging letter written on top of a 12-foot wide by 18-foot long chocolate cake, which was much nicer than what the editor of Elle magazine did. When I said no to her, she came around and threw a brick through the front window. And it wasn't even a chocolate-covered brick." "Oh dear," said Michael. He didn't really understand what his nanny was talking about, but he wanted to be supportive. "It's all right," said Nanny Piggins. "As a Piggins, I have been raised to cope with this type of constant pressure. The women in my family have been living with the burden of extreme beauty ever since Helen of Troy." "Helen of Troy was a relative of yours?" asked Derek. "Well, she was a woman so beautiful, her kidnapping triggered the Trojan War, a conflict so famous people are still talking about it 3,500 years later," said Nanny Piggins. You don't think a human is capable of that level of beauty, do you?" "No, of course," said Derek. "I don't know what I was thinking." "Although, to be fair, I wouldn't say she started it," said Nanny Piggins, "because it was in no way Helen's fault. It's always men who start wars. Except for my distant cousin Boadicea Piggins, but that's a different story for another day. Anyway, it's usually men who start wars. It's hardly Helen's fault if she was so impossibly beautiful that 2 nations' worth of men totally lost their minds and spent 10 years trying to kill each other." "Wasn't she kidnapped by Paris, the Trojan prince?" asked Michael. "Yes," said Nanny Piggins, "but that was not the first time Helen was kidnapped." "Really?" said Samantha. "She got kidnapped twice." "Oh, yes," said Nanny Piggins. "Years earlier, she'd been kidnapped by Theseus. You know, the hero who fought the Minotaur and saved all those young people from being eaten." "But he was a goody," said Michael. "He was to start with. That was when he was a young man. But by the time he became middle-aged, Theseus turned evil." "You're going to have to tell us the whole story," said Derek. "All right, I will," said Nanny Piggins. "But you'd better help yourselves to some Anzac biscuits. You'll need energy to process all the information with which I'm about to bombard your minds. And they are the perfect snack because Anzac Cove in modern Turkey is only 19 kilometres from the location of Troy in the ancient world." Once Nanny Piggins, Boris and the children had a biscuit in each hand and several in their stomachs, Nanny Piggins began her tale. "So, as I say, it all began when Theseus, the famous Greek hero, made a pledge with his bestest best friend ever, Pirithous, that they would both get married." "Well, that sounds nice," said Samantha. "Yes, but there was a catch," said Nanny Piggins. "They both decided that because they were so wonderful, they had to marry a daughter of Zeus. No one else would be good enough for them." "Really?" said Samantha. "That's not very gentlemanly," observed Boris. "No," agreed Nanny Piggins. "Now, to be fair, Zeus did have quite a few daughters. Theseus got first pick and he chose Helen. She was the daughter of Zeus and Leda." "Who was Leda?" asked Derek. "She was the Queen of Sparta," said Nanny Piggins. "So she was married to the King of Sparta, but Leda was so good-looking that Zeus decided he wanted to marry her too." "Oh, Zeus, he was such a rotter," muttered Samantha. Leda was not interested in taking on a second husband, so Zeus disguised himself as a swan. "A swan?" said Michael. "Yes, it worked because Leda liked him much better when he was a swan, and one thing led to another, and Leda gave birth to 2 eggs. "She gave birth to 2 eggs," said Samantha. "Look, just don't ask follow-up questions," said Nanny Piggins. "This story does not make any sense, but if you apply scientific reasoning, it's only going to ruin the story." "Okay. So the eggs hatched, and Helen and her brother Pollux were born from one of them. And Castor, he was a boy, and Clymnestra, a girl, were born from the other. So altogether, they were quadruplets. But that wasn't the most interesting thing about these babies. The main thing about the birth, it was that Helen, when she was born, was instantly the most beautiful woman on earth." "But she was a baby," said Michael. "She wasn't a woman yet." "No, but already she was so beautiful as a baby. And then day by day she grew even more beautiful. So by the time she was a teenager, she was so stunningly gorgeous she could barely leave the house. Everyone who got a glimpse of her fell in love at first sight. She was constantly being bombarded with marriage proposals. Men were always fainting in awe or dropping dead of heart attacks. Either way, clogging up the streets, it was very inconvenient. But the main thing is, Theseus heard about this, and he decided he was so wonderful and famous and brave, he should be the one to marry Helen." "Well, what did Helen think?" asked Samantha. "Nobody knows," said Nanny Piggins. "Homer, the poet who wrote down the story back then, didn't write anything about her opinion. I mean, maybe it was censorship. Maybe he knew that what she thought about it all was so rude that it couldn't go down in print. Or maybe, because Homer was a poet, he didn't write down what she thought because it was too hard to find a rhyme to go with it." "Oh, perhaps Helen didn't like Theseus because he was orange," said Boris. "It's very hard to find something that rhymes with the word orange." "Yes, that might have been it," said Nanny Piggins. "All right, let's all imagine that Theseus was bright orange, and that's why Helen didn't want to marry him. So, Theseus went and kidnapped Helen. But he didn't marry her straight away because Pirithous had to capture a bride too. They wanted to have a double wedding, you see, which was actually quite sensible because it was a good way to save money on catering. Anyway, Pirithous decided that he would marry the beautiful Persephone. Persephone, said Derek, but wasn't she the wife of Hades, the god of the underworld? Yes, that's the one, said Nanny Piggins. But she was already married, argued Michael. Yes, I told you, these men were rotters. Back in the ancient Greek story days, men weren't always as respectful of marriage vows as they should have been. So Theseus and Pirithous travelled down to the underworld to kidnap Persephone. Hades was not super impressed by their plan. You see, he really, genuinely loved his wife. But he was a god, therefore ancient and wise, so instead of killing them instantly, Hades decided to torture them a bit first. Hades pretended to be really polite to Theseus and Pirithous. He offered them a seat and said, "Let's sit down and talk about it." But the chair he gave them to sit on was a magic chair, and as soon as their bottoms touched the seat, snakes rose up out of the chair and bound them to the armrests, and then bit them constantly for the rest of eternity. So Theseus was never able to return to marry Helen. "Oh, phew," said Samantha. Yes, and Helen was able to return to her family. "Well, that's nice," said Boris. Yes, but she was still the most beautiful woman in the entire world, so her brothers had to decide who to marry her off to. "Well, couldn't she decide for herself?" asked Samantha. "Oh, no," said Nanny Piggins. "Beautiful women were not allowed to make decisions for themselves back in the ancient Greek story days. No, the decision was up to Castor and Pollux." "Her brothers?" asked Samantha. "Yes," said Nanny Piggins. Samantha eyed Derek and Michael. She liked her brothers very much, but it would never occur to her to let them make major life decisions on her behalf. And to be fair, Derek and Michael didn't want to make major life decisions for Samantha either. They didn't really like making decisions for themselves, let alone anybody else. So, all the eligible men, the princes and heroes of Greece, they all travelled to Sparta to compete to be the one who would get to marry Helen. Now, Castor and Pollux were a bit worried. All the most important and powerful men in Greece were coming to their hometown, desperate to marry their sister. They could only agree for one of these men to marry her, and they knew for a fact that she was so beautiful that all the men who weren't allowed to marry her would then want to kidnap her, and having your sister kidnapped is a hassle that they could do without. Luckily, Odysseus was also there, and she was the only person in ancient Greece who had any common sense, so Castor and Pollux asked her for advice. And Odysseus, being Odysseus, soon came up with a cunning plan. "What you should do is make all the suitors swear an oath that if anyone does kidnap Helen after you decide on a husband, that they will all raise an army each, join up together and go to rescue her." "That's brilliant," said Pollux. "That way we won't have to go and get her back on our own." "Also, Greek men's warped sense of honour means they're more likely to uphold a vow than the basic sense of decency that would prevent them from kidnapping a woman," agreed Castor. So that's what they did. They made all the suitors swear an oath. Then Castor and Pollux chose a husband for their sister Helen. "Well, who did they choose?" asked Samantha. "Did they pick the nicest man?" "Or the most handsome?" asked Michael. "Or the richest?" asked Derek. "In a way they did," said Nanny Piggins. "They chose Menelaus because he sent them the richest gift, a deliciously rich chocolate mud cake." "Oh, how romantic," sniffled Boris. He loved love stories. They always made him weepy. So Menelaus married Helen, and then they became the king and queen of Sparta. They ruled Sparta for 10 years, and they had a daughter who they called Hermione. "Hermione? You mean like the character from Harry Potter?" asked Michael. "Well, it's the same name," said Nanny Piggins, "but I doubt it's the same person. Although, who knows? Maybe the character from Harry Potter is the 3,000-year-old daughter of Helen of Troy. If that was the case, it's a shame they didn't include it in the book. It would have made a cracking plot twist." Okay, but that's just the backstory. Meanwhile, while all this was going on in Sparta, on a hillside in Turkey, the country, not the bird, there was a shepherd called Paris, who was no relation to the city Paris. Paris was just his name. It was a coincidence. Anyway, Paris was sitting in a field, minding his sheep one day, when the goddesses Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite all turned up at once and demanded he decide which one of them was the most beautiful. Now, obviously, Paris did not want to pick, but Aphrodite promised him that if he picked her, she would make sure that Paris got to marry the most beautiful woman on the entire earth. Now, that sounded pretty good to Paris, so straight away he picked Aphrodite, and kapow! She whipped him off to Sparta to marry Helen. But Helen was already married, said Michael. Well, the Greek gods didn't worry too much about stuff like that, said Nanny Piggins, and neither did Paris. He waited until Menelaus popped out for the day, then he burst into Helen's chamber. "Wow," said Paris, seeing her for the first time. "It's true, you really are stunningly beautiful. I should have worn sunglasses. When I look at you, it's hard to even think straight." "What are you doing here?" demanded Helen. "On second thoughts, I don't want to know. Just leave right now." "I will leave, but you're coming with me," said Paris. "I'm kidnapping you. Look, I've brought a potato sack to carry you off with, and I washed it specially. You can barely smell the potatoes anymore." "Oh, that is nice and thoughtful," said Boris. "It's so much nicer to be kidnapped in a big sack. If the sack is too small, it's ever so upsetting to try and squeeze in." "But I don't want to be kidnapped," argued Helen. "Well, you don't have any choice," said Paris. "The goddess Aphrodite promised you to me." "But I don't belong to her," said Helen. "She can't do that." "I think goddesses can do whatever they like," said Paris. "3 of them just turned up in my field and forced me to judge a beauty contest. They're very unbending people." "Well, I can't be kidnapped by you," said Helen. "I'm married and my husband will get very cross." "Yes, but I'm younger and better looking than him," said Paris. "You're a shepherd," said Helen. "I don't mean to be disrespectful to people who work in farming, but my current husband is a king. He doesn't expect me to sleep on the grass in a field every night." "Oh, that's okay," said Paris, "because I'm also secretly the son of the king of Troy." "Really?" said Helen. "Then why do you work as a shepherd?" "Well, apparently, when I was born, there was a prophecy that I would bring about the destruction of the entire city of Troy," explained Paris. "So my father decided to leave me in a field to die. But I survived because I was nurtured for 9 days by a bear." "A bear?" exclaimed Boris. "Did you give him a honey sandwich?" "Probably. Anyway, he survived, which is the main thing." "Of course he did, if he lived off honey sandwiches for 9 days. Anyway, the shepherd who abandoned me felt sorry about it all, and eventually came back and took me in himself." "Well, he should have left the baby with the bear," said Boris. "But I suppose the bear probably had better things to do, like go and pursue a career as a ballerina." "Yes, I'm sure that was it," said Nanny Piggins. "Can I get back to the story now?" "Yes, of course," said Boris. "Well, that's not a very believable backstory," said Helen. "I think I'd prefer to stay here with my husband and daughter." "But Aphrodite promised me your hand in marriage," protested Paris. "Well, then Aphrodite is a very cheeky goddess who should mind her own business," said Helen, getting fed up with this conversation and getting ready to stomp on a few feet and bite a few shins. Now, this whole time, Aphrodite had been loitering in the room. The gods and goddesses did a lot of that back in the ancient story days. They just hung around being invisible and eavesdropping. We mustn't judge them too harshly. There was no TV, so they had to do something to amuse themselves. Anyway, Aphrodite realised that she had to step in if her deal with Paris was going to work. So she used her goddess powers on Helen. "What sort of goddess powers?" asked Michael. "I don't know exactly," said Nanny Piggins. "I imagine it's top-secret goddess business, but whatever she did, it worked. She totally bewitched Helen, so that Helen voluntarily stepped into Paris's sack and allowed herself to be kidnapped willingly." "But what about her daughter?" asked Samantha. "Well, Hermione was left behind," said Nanny Piggins, which really was probably for the best, because it meant that she could go on to star in the Harry Potter books. But the person who really lost out was King Menelaus. He came home and discovered his wife was missing, and he got really, really upset. "Oh no, my wife is gone," wailed the king. "And I'll never find another one that beautiful, because she was the most beautiful woman in the world." Well, couldn't he find the nicest or the kindest woman in the world instead? Asked Samantha. That wasn't such a priority back in the ancient Greek mythology days. Like the editors of Vogue magazine, ancient Greek kings were very superficial. King Menelaus wailed and moaned and generally threw a tantrum when suddenly he remembered the vow that all the suitors were forced to take, and he activated that vow. The suitors were all men of honour. They could not refuse. They had to raise an army each and go to war to retrieve Helen. And so he sent out messages to them all, and soon 1,000 ships full of Greek soldiers set sail to go to war against Troy. 1,000, said Derek. Yes, and that's how Helen came to be known as the face who launched 1,000 ships, said Nanny Piggins. In fact, she's become a unit of measurement. A millihelen is the amount of beauty it takes to launch one ship. Oh, right. So did Menelaus get Helen back? Asked Michael. Did she want to go back? Asked Samantha. Was she reunited with Hermione? Asked Boris. Did she fall in love with Paris? Asked Derek. Well, that's the story of the Trojan War, said Nanny Piggins. A story so epic, with so much bravery, treachery, and killing each other in sword fights, it would take me weeks to tell you it all. Oh, I suppose we can't do that then, said Michael, because we got to go to school tomorrow. Oh, no, I just mean I'll have to bake you some more snacks before I continue. The end. Time for bed. All right, well, that's the backstory, the story of Helen, Helen of Troy, whose kidnapping triggered the Trojan War. And we'll be getting into more stories from that epic tale in the weeks to come. All right, well, that's it for now. Until next time, goodbye. Hello, it's me again. If you enjoyed listening to Bedtime Stories with R.A. Spratt, it would be really helpful if you could like, subscribe, follow, and or review the show on whatever podcast platform you're listening to now. Every little one of those digital affirmations helps, and the bigger this podcast gets, the more I can justify procrastinating from my real job to keep bringing these stories to you. Thank you.